Hey fellow Netrunners, today I'll be discussing agenda suites in the context of competitive play. This was motivated by one of the posts I saw on the SteamHack forums, where someone was wondering about agenda compositions, and I do enjoy talking about agenda suites and agenda compositions a lot, and feel like this is a good topic for me to discuss today. I've done videos on this in the past, and I've talked about it in numerous videos, but this is a good place to actually look back on the past year and see what agendas have competitive players decided to converge or collapse on. I'll give a bit of motivation to start off this presentation before delving into the discussion on agenda ratios as well as Global Food Initiative, which I feel is a very important agenda to discuss, so important that I have to mention it separately. Then we'll proceed to analyze some standard decks and what they have in common in terms of agenda suites before we conclude this presentation. So to start off, as of the time of this recording, there are a total of 83 agendas in the current card pool. That's a lot of agendas to choose from. Gone are the old days where you're forced to include priority requisition and private security force in every single deck. Now you actually have a plethora of options to choose from. Unfortunately, a lot of top tier decks seem to share a lot of similar agendas, to the point where most agendas remain unplayed. Why is this the case? Is the power disparity between agendas that large such that competitive players decide to only play the best of the best agendas? Well, that's what we'll talk about today. So let's start off by looking at a sample Wayland kill agenda suite. By today's standards, this agenda suite is considered very spicy. A typical kill deck will like to leverage these agendas. The Cleaners helps them deal more meat damage. Poster Bounty helps land attacks, which then allows the corp to kill the runner with cards like Scorched Earth. Project Atlas is there to search up these cards like Scorched Earth from the deck, and Hostile Takeover and Oaktown is there as agendas that give money. So that sounds pretty good. That sounds like a solid plan. That sounds like a coherent agenda suite. Unfortunately, this agenda suite sees almost no play in the competitive scene, if at all. Why is this? Apart from the fact that Wayland is currently in a very horrible situation, one important thing to know about this agenda suite is that it's not very good in terms of defensibility. The runner only needs to steal 4 agendas of the 10 to win. Now, this might have been acceptable, say, 2 years ago, in a meta where everyone was playing with very lousy agenda suites. But with the advent of a lot of much better agendas nowadays, 4 out of 10 just doesn't cut it. Not to mention that in certain scenarios, the runner could just win the game with 3 agendas instead of 4. If they steal a copy of the Cleaners, they can very well win on 3 agendas, which means that the game will end sooner than you will believe, and that's not good for the core. So what makes agendas good and what makes them bad? A lot of this comes down to their agenda point ratio. And the ratio is determined by the number of advancements they require to the number of agenda points they give. Good agendas are these ones. 3-2 agendas are by far considered the best agenda ratio to have. So good, in fact, that they have decided not to print neutral 3-2 agendas. Merger's the exception, but we all know why that is not a good agenda. That aside, 3-2 agendas are very good and often see a lot of play because they are never advanceable and can be fast advanced, being 3 advancements required. And this is quite important because this means that they can often slip through to your scoring area undetected by the runner. Lots of runners don't really want to run to access an unadvanced card, especially if it's under a bunch of ice. So the fact that being able to score these agendas easily gives you a good number of points, 2 agenda points leaves you a third of the way to victory, is a really good thing. This is complemented by 2-1 agendas, which are known as fast advance fodder. These are quite important to some decks because the court requires 7 agenda points to win. This is an odd number, so 2 pointers can only get you up to 6 points. It can get you up to 8 points, but that requires you scoring a 4th agenda, which could be tedious. 2-1 agendas allows you to achieve this 7 point very easily because it's fast advanceable, meaning that You don't really need to protect a remote to score these. You just have to top deck it off R&D and then install double advance it to score. This is why 2-1 agendas are really good. 4-2 agendas are also considered good, if only because there are not that many 3-2 and 2-1 agendas available. As I said, most of these are restricted to their individual factions, and you can't really make 20 agenda points, which is the minimum required, using just 3-2 and 2-1 agendas. Therefore, 4-2s are standard agendas used to pad out the rest of your deck. Now, the not so good agendas are these. 3-pointer agendas are just bad in general because they allow the runner to win by stealing 3 agendas instead of 4. With 3 pointers, runners can now win by stealing a 3 in many various combinations. In fact, 3-2-2 gives you 7 points, the runner can win on 3 agendas. 3-3-2 also gives the runner 3 agenda points. There are lots of combinations in which 3 pointers will give the runner the victory after stealing only 3 agendas, and by cutting the number of agendas the runner requires by a quarter, that's probably not a good thing for you as the core. So this is why 3 pointers are usually not seen in competitive play. If they are, it's mostly because the deck uses mostly 3-pointer agendas. This means that if your deck is composed mostly of 3-pointer agendas, you will have very few agendas in your deck, say 6 or 7. And that kind of mitigates things because the chance of a runner actually hitting an agenda from excess is much lower. That being said, a pure 5-3 deck is probably not the way to go, considering that they are so difficult to score as the core. 3-1 agendas are the worst. I still stand by that. They give you too little in benefit for the amount of tempo loss it requires for you to score them. Install and triple advance, just 1 point. The 3-2 agendas give you twice as many. So yeah, that alone makes it a very bad agenda. Not to mention that it bloats up your deck. This is probably the biggest sin. The fact that it takes up so many deck slots means that you have less deck slots for flexible cards like Snare that actually do interesting things. Cards like Economy, Ice, bare basics that you need. Instead of playing those, you're playing agendas. Cards that are your liability, cards that the runner wants to see. Why are you doing that? You need to have a very, very good reason to include 3-1 agendas in your deck by the very virtue of their very poor agenda ratio. So we've covered the good, we've covered the bad, let's go for the ugly, defensive agendas. Now, these are not necessarily new. They have been around since Genesis. Fetal AI was the very first defensive agenda printed, and it's actually a pretty fun agenda, I have to admit. However, as more and more of these have been printed, we start to see a problem. They protect themselves from being stolen, which is nice. But the thing is, most corps don't really want to score agendas. If you think about it, a lot of agendas don't really contribute to your win condition, or just give you too little utility or power for the amount of effort you spend advancing them. You most of the time you'll be happier clicking for credits or icing up your servers instead. So, not to mention that oftentimes you find yourself agenda flooded because 20 agenda points in 49 cards is a bit much. Therefore, a lot of corps have decided to gravitate to defensive agendas that they rather not score and are relatively happy for the runner to steal on their behalf. So this is the problem with defensive agendas, because they are slowly but surely encouraging corp archetypes that don't rely on agendas to win at all. And we've seen that in the form of prison decks. But still, they have provided some positivity to the meta in terms of balancing the corp and runner win ratios, so I can't complain too much. However, in a discussion on agenda suites, we must point these out, and what the most important defensive agenda to talk about is none other than Global Food Initiative. This agenda was released almost exactly 1 year ago in Data and Destiny. The biggest problem with Global Food Initiative is that there is zero counterplay in the runner half of the card pool. There are lots of cards in Netrunner, and there are lots of counters to these cards. Caprice is countered by Political Operative and Rumor Mill. Astroscript is countered by Claude, countered by Turntable. Global Food has virtually no counter. Only soft counters like Notoriety and Freedom through Equality, but nothing that directly interacts with the text box. Until FFG prints a card that says ignore the text box of all agendas in the runner score area or something to that effect. This will remain one of the most dominant forces in the metagame. In fact, if you look at the competitive decks across all factions, almost every single deck runs Global Foot Initiative. And there's a very good reason for that. By reducing the number of effective agenda points for the runner in your deck from 20 to 17, assuming you run the full 3 copies of Global Foot. This means that the runner can only steal a maximum of 17 points because the Global Foots are only worth 2 points instead of 3 to them. This drastically reduces the number, or rather, this significantly increases the number of accesses the runner must make in order to reach their win condition of 7 agenda points. And that's a very big deal. Imagine you're playing a game of snakes and ladders. Normally, you need to get to square number 100 to win. But if you can somehow force your opponents to require them to go to square, say, 120 to win, you now have a huge advantage. So that's the logic behind this, and why Global Foot is such a dominant agenda now. I also like to digress right now and talk about how the onset of Global Foot has actually affected the viability of certain runner archetypes. Most runner decks can be put on this scale from passive to aggressive. In the past, say 2 years ago, the best runners were those that were aggressive, the run-based criminal. That was the big thing back then, and criminal was by far the most popular faction, and a very good reason for that, because the corresponding most powerful corp was Astrobiotics, a very fast NBN corporation that can easily get up to 7 agenda points in a matter of a few turns. To match the speed of Astrobiotics, you had to play a runner deck that could go fast, that could win fast, and that was why criminals was so popular. However, ever since in the past year, a lot of things have changed. Astroscript has been errated to be limit 1 per deck, which kills Astrobiotics in effect, and makes the fastest corp a lot slower. On the same token, Global Foot was introduced, which means that corps are now encouraged to play slower. Slower corps become more viable because runners cannot steal that many points before the corp gets set up, get all their servers iced up, and can begin scoring points. This is where the metagame shifts from the aggressive side to the passive side. This is why in the past 2 worlds, we've seen a lot more control style decks, more shapers, more regular anarchs than before. This is because these decks could not stand up to the speed of Astrobiotics. These decks couldn't even get the Breaker Suite set up before Astrobiotics threatened match point. But now that Astrobiotics is gone, these control decks are now in the forefront of the game's meta. And Run-Based Criminal has faded away to almost oblivion, because you can't play aggressive runner decks anymore. These decks tend to be very aggressive in the early game, but when Global Foot is a thing now in most decks, most runners will find it very difficult to reach 4 or even 6 agenda points in the early game. And this is what they rely on to win, because if they don't get up to this number of agenda points, they will eventually get suffocated and locked out of servers. Run-based criminals simply doesn't have the late game potential. And this is what Global Foot does to the runner meta. So it's not just because criminals haven't been receiving good cards lately. It is also due to the fundamental shift in corp archetypes to more slower, more glaciary, more passive, more agenda defense decks that make run-based criminal, or aggressive decks for that matter, a lot worse. So now let's move on to the meat of this presentation. I'll be talking about agenda suites in various factions. We'll be breaking it down by each faction. We'll be looking at competitive decks within each faction and analyzing their similarities. We'll start off with HB, Hasboroid. In Hasboroid, it's very simple. All the competitive decks pretty much have the same agenda composition. 2 global foods and 7 2-pointers of their choosing. This is a very solid agenda suite because there are only 9 agendas in the deck, and the runner needs to steal 4 to win. No questions about that. All the agendas are worth 2 points to the runner, they need to steal 4. Exactly that. While typically the corp only needs to score 3. That's a very big advantage. And this is true even though the HB archetypes I'm about to explain are all wildly different. Full Codes is a glacier archetype. It relies on scoring agendas the hard way via heavily iced remotes with upgrades. Bleed Purple and Sleeper Hole are fast advanced HB decks that rely on Jeeves and Baltic Labor to fast advanced agendas. Battle of Wits, created by the Big Boy, is a Mushin Trappy HB deck. And CI7, which is a Cerebral Imaging combo deck, tries to score 7 agenda points in a single turn. All these HB archetypes are very, very different, but they share the agenda suite in common. They all use 2 global foods and 7 2-pointers of their choosing. The 2-pointers they choose vary between the decks. Obviously, some agendas work out better in certain archetypes, and this is where you get the diversity in agenda suites, but all of them play 2 global foods. Every competitive player has realized that global food is so good because it reduces the number of agendas you need to run for the runner to steal 4 to win. And that's just a very fundamentally big deal. Even though you can't fast advance the global food in those fast advanced decks, even though it has no ability when scored in the Glacier deck, it is still the top tier agenda to run, even though it costs 2 influence to include. Every HB deck happily includes it because the defense ability is so much more important. The ability to not lose to random accesses. We move on to the Jinteki agenda suite, which kind of looks like the same. In fact, it is exactly the same. Lots of Palana decks have dominated the meta during the regional season. They try to use the combination of Nisei Mark II and Caprice to win. In essence, it's basically Glacier RP in Palana. And these decks still use the same agenda suite because, once again, the runner needs 4 out of 9 to win. It's as simple as that. There's another possible agenda suite for Jinteki, and this relies on another defensive agenda, the Future Perfect. So by playing the Future Perfect in conjunction with Global Food, you have enough 3-pointers in your deck such that you can reduce the total number of agendas in your deck from 9 to 8. So that's a very good thing. The runner needs to steal 4 of these 8 agendas to win. If they're lucky and they somehow steal one of your 2 Future Perfects, then they only need 3. But otherwise, 4 out of 8 is a very, very nasty ratio. The fact that the runner has to steal half the agendas in your deck to win is rather ludicrous. And you can see this in 2 very contrasting decks. You have standard Palana Glacier, as mentioned before, but you also have IG49, also known as Hink's IG. This runs more defensive agendas like Fetal AIs in place of Nisei Mark IIs and Philotic Entanglement for the kill instead of Corporate Sales Team, but the idea stays the same. You have very solid defensive agendas, 5-3 agendas in the form of Future Perfect and Global Food that protect your agenda from massive R&D digs. Now what about NBN? NBN has typically never run 5-3 agendas simply because they had a critical mass of good 2-pointers in the form of Bill and Astroscript. But now that Astroscript has been errated to 1 per deck, things have changed. And now the most dominant yellow decks all run 3 global foods. This is also partially because of exchange of information, but that's another story for another day. The dominant agenda suite is as such: 3 global foods, 3 breaking news, and 4 2-pointers, typically 3 bills and 1 Astroscript. This is a 4 out of 10 agenda suite for the runner, so it is slightly more vulnerable than the HB or Palana variants, mostly because of the addition of breaking news to dilute the agenda density. However, if the runner steals, if the 2 of the agendas in the runner's score area are breaking news, then stealing 4 agendas doesn't cut it. They need to steal 5, and this could happen through EOI. This is secretly what actually makes this deck very powerful. The fact that it changes 4 out of 10 to 5 out of 10 if EOI is successful means that a lot of the time the runner actually has a very difficult time finding the agendas to win. If you look at Astrobaltic's agenda suite of yesteryear, they had 11 agendas and the runner only needed to steal 4. Now with Global Food in the mix, the modern ambient agenda suite only has fewer agendas and potentially requires the runner to steal more if they are the victim of EOI, if they somehow end up having all the breaking news in the score area. And this is really, really vicious, and this is one of the reasons why standard CTM, which won Worlds this year, is so powerful. There was also Biotic Sync, which works on mostly the same agenda suite, but since Sync has a lower agenda requirement, they can shave off 1 bill and still pose an equally difficult agenda suite to break as the runner. So I've just described a lot of agenda suites. As you can see, a lot of them have global food initiative in them, and there's a very good reason why that's the case. By reducing the number of agendas in your deck and increasing the number of agendas the runner has to steal in order to win, you're basically manipulating the win condition directly, just through your deck choices. You don't even need to make any particular plays in the game. Every single game, inherently, as long as you have global food in your deck, the odds are tilted in your favor. So you need a very good reason as a deck brewer to deviate from this norm. You need to have a very good reason to not play these agenda suites. One possible reason is that your deck goes super lightning fast. If your deck wins very quickly in a matter of a few turns, you don't really care about your agenda density, right? Because by the time the runner finds 5 or 6 agenda points, you should have won by then. In these cases, it is acceptable to either play an agenda suite that has lots of agendas or an agenda suite that features 3-pointers that are not global food. Here are some examples. Russian NEH is the new Astrobiotics. Without 3 copies of Astro, you're forced to play lots of small agendas to make up your agenda suite. As such, Russian NEH actually runs 13 agendas, which is crazy. However, it can win so quickly between the economy advantage of advanced assembly lines and the click advantage of Jeeves model bioroids that it justifies this agenda suite. And this is actually a very powerful deck. It has actually taken down regionals in the past. So yes, this is quite legit. At Worlds, we saw Dean's Yellow Railgun do very well. This actually shares a lot in common with the Russian NEH agenda suite. The only difference is that it swapped out 2 BUs and 2 license acquisitions for 3-pointers. And while this looks like a huge liability, the fact that it runs a restructured data pool, in reality, this boom shutdown NEH deck goes so quickly and assembles its combos only in the span of a few turns. A lot of runners have great difficulty finding 7 agenda points before the combos assemble and the runner gets killed. So in both cases, the influence was so tight that they couldn't afford to spend influence on, say, NAPD contract or Global Food Initiative to go to defense agendas. Russian NEH required the influence to spend on purple cards such as Jeeves, such as advanced assembly lines and team sponsorship in order to include Jeeves model bioroids using the alliance clause. As for Dean's deck, needed all the influence he could get to play accelerated diagnostics, power shutdowns, and booms. This is why he didn't have the influence left to show up the agenda suite. Both ways, it's still acceptable, simply because the decks go so quickly, you don't really worry about the agenda density. Another reason you can deviate from norm is because you're running an agenda defensive ID. Argus Security, Harpsichord Studios, Jinteki, Personal Evolution. These decks punish runners for stealing agendas. As such, you can justify running lots of 1-pointers, and these are the only identities in which running 3 1s is actually something that you can even consider. Because if you're playing these identities, you're typically trying to maximize the number of times with which you fire the ID so as to punish the runner. In which case, fair enough, I'll give the free pass to you. Finally, another reason to deviate from the norm is because your deck has a primary win condition that is not based on agenda points. In other words, you're playing a prison deck. As such, if you're not intending to score agendas to win at all, then you don't really need to care about your agenda suite. Or do you? You still do. But you care about different things. Instead of caring about the agenda ratio, you care about how defensive the agenda is. And right now with the card pool, that basically entails jamming every single defensive agenda you can get your hands on. So let's look at some examples. Yeah, I have to give myself a personal plug here. Theory Info, which I took to runners up at Worlds this year, managed just that. You can see every single agenda basically has a defensive ability apart from the 3 breaking news, which I need to activate 24/7 news cycle. And yeah, I'm basically just looking at all the defensive agendas that NBN has access to and going, okay, so I'll go shopping. I'll shop for global foods, quantum predictives, 15 minutes. I need 2 more agenda points. Let's go with NAPD. Done. Timmy Wong did something similar with his Info Refinery deck, also out of sync, playing 3 global foods and 3 NAPDs. for maximum annoyance. Again, the only squishy agendas are breaking news because he needs them to tag the runner. The prison deck that we're talking about is exemplified by IG54, which was very popular at the height of the Mumbat cycle. That was during regional season. It featured an agenda suite that looks like something like this: Global Foods, Future Perfects, and 2 Fetal AIs. All defensive agendas. 100% purely defensive. And this is why this deck is so hard to beat. You need to steal 4 of these to win, and 3, technically 3 of these, but if you don't steal Future Perfect, you need to steal 4 of them. And all of them are so difficult to steal. Fetal sets you back in terms of tempo, and Future Perfect, you need to side game for the win. So this is a very torturous agenda suite, but this is what happens when you play decks that don't have an agenda win condition. Now, of course, I believe Timmy's deck tries to win via agendas, and my deck can win via agendas as well using exchange of information. So it's not just the prison decks that use this tactic, but generally you can just see the sheer power of just jamming defensive agendas in your agenda suite. It makes it that much harder for the runner to win, which means conversely, you are advancing your win condition as well, lengthening the game so that you can find the pieces you need to win the game. So to conclude this presentation, basically, with defensive agendas on the rise, cards like Global Food Initiative and NAPD Contract, this has warped the meta in certain ways. Aggressive runners are now nowhere to be seen, and more importantly, this is where we get prison decks from. I'm pretty sure prison decks wouldn't be as much of a thing if there were no defensive agendas around. Deck brewing for you. For the regular viewer, like yourself, who's tuning in, what should you take home from this video? Well, if you don't have a good reason to, just stick to one of these agenda suites. You can toy around with the 2-pointers and maybe even the 1-pointers that are in these agenda suites, but in general, there's a very good reason why a lot of these decks run global foods and why these decks tend to have very flat agenda distributions. You'll notice that outside of NBN, when we look at Jinteki and HB's agenda distribution, they are very flat. All 2-pointers except for global food. And there's a good reason for that. With this agenda consistency, you consistently make it very hard for the runner to win the game on agenda points. And this is a hallmark of a good deck consistency. If you want to jam any new agendas in your deck, you must give it a good think. If it does not consistently advance your game by a significant amount, you really should think twice before including it, because doing so is rather detrimental, because a lot of the times just swapping the agenda for a generic defensive agenda like NAPD or Global Food is just so much better, because these agendas work every single game, no matter what the archetype of the runner that you're facing against. So that's all I have for this video, and I hope you found this insightful. Thanks for watching and happy net running. I'll see you around.